All of webinar. Our subject today is the 70 years of Chinese colonial rule in Tibet, and the organizers are Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement and the Tibetan Youth Congress. On behalf of these two organizations, I welcome our panelists and our audience. Welcome this evening for joining this show. In the beginning, I will give a introduction to our honored panelists, and then we shift over to the main talks. To start with, I welcome Mr. Kai Mueller. Hello, Kai Mueller. Welcome. Mr. Kai is from Berlin. He is the executive director of the International Campaign for Tibet in Germany since 2005. And as everybody knows, ICT is one of the foremost organizations which is running a campaign in favor of Tibet and advocacy for Tibet among governments and parliaments. So you are welcome here. The ICT, as it coordinates in United Nations the advocacy, and Mr. Mueller has testified before various parliaments, the European Parliament also, and the UN human rights bodies. So he is a jurist and a social scientist by training. He's a political scientist, a public administration expert in public administration. And as we all know, ICT has many feathers to its cap in European Union as well as recently in America. So welcome, Mr. Kai Mueller, to this webinar. We have with us today evening a very prominent expert on Chinese affairs, Mr. Jayadeva Ranade. Welcome, Mr. Jayadeva Ranade. Mr. Ranade is a very famous personality in India, especially in Asia and international forums when it comes to China. He has been additional secretary in the cabinet secretariat of Government of India, and he is presently the president of Center for China Analysis and Strategy. He is a member of the ICWA, the core group of ICWA on China, and he is a distinguished fellow with the Center for Air Power Studies and Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. So Mr. Ranade has an experience of 50 years. He has had many important postings in China and in other countries. He is an expert in Chinese language. He's one of those few experts, China experts in India, who understand how the Chinese system, especially the Communist Party and the governing system functions, how they take decisions. So welcome, Mr. Ranade, to this evening webinar. So, and now we have Sana Hashmi, a very young scholar, an Indian scholar who is today stationed in Taiwan. Sana Hashmi is currently the visiting professor at Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation, and she is a non-resident fellow at Taiwan's Next Gen Foundation. Welcome, Sana, to this show. Sana is the author of China's Approach Towards Territorial Disputes, Lessons and Prospects, which is a very good reference book on how China has handled its border issues with the countries around, about 14 countries. So she has a very good insight of that. And she has been a consultant with the Ministry of External Affairs of India, and she has been associated with Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, National Chengchi University's Institute of International Relations, the Center for Air Power Studies, South Asia Forum for Human Rights, and Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies, which is a very prominent institute in India. It's a project of Central, and she has been associated with the Central Tibetan Administration also as an advisor. So welcome, Sana, to this evening. Now we have Mr. Tenzin Sundu. Mr. Tenzin Sundu is more known than I can explain. He is the most famous and loved faces of Tibetan freedom movement across the world. He has been in the limelight for very courageous reasons and right reasons, and on so many occasions. So he is a poet, he's a writer, he's an activist, and he was born to a Tibetan refugee couple in northern India in the Himalayas, where they were construction workers. So he has 4 books to his credit, and these books are very famous. He was the first winner of Outlook Picador Award for his writings, and his writings have been part of as textbooks in various universities and colleges of India. He not only has encouraged new younger generation of Tibetans in their freedom movement, he has also been a source of inspiration for many films. We have Mr. Gonpo Dhundup. He is the president of Tibetan Youth Congress. Welcome, Gonpo Dhundupji. Tibetan Youth Congress is the best known name among Tibetan diaspora. It is the largest socio-cultural political organization of Tibetan refugee community. And Mr. Gonpo Dhundup has been a very dynamic leader, known for his leadership qualities, social work, much before he became the president of TYC. So he is a very well-known political activist, a social worker. These days, he is very seriously and full-time involved in helping people who need support in COVID-related problems. So he's running around everywhere in Dharamsala and places around to hospitals, etc. So it's a privilege to have you with us. Thank you, Mr. Gonpo Dhundupji. We have Professor Ayushi Ketkar, who is an assistant professor at there is a special center at GNU which is called Special Center for National Security Studies, and she specializes in international relations. And Professor Ketkar has been previously associated with many institutions like Gautam Buddha University in Greater Noida, Amity University, Symbiosis, Bhosala Military College, Nasik, and she has been with think tanks like the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies and the Jammu Kashmir Study Center. So welcome, Ayushi, to this group. And of course, it's last but not least, our youngest member, Anjali Mishra, who is a budding journalist. Welcome, Anjali, to this group. She has been helping us with our media-related activities, and she is a third-year student of journalism in university, which is in Noida. So welcome, everybody. And now we start today evening's talks. I first request Mr. Kai Mueller to please make your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank VIJAY KRANTI for this kind introduction, and also Tibetan Youth Congress and the Chase Center for Himalayan Asian Studies and Engagement for having me for this very, I think, timely discussion, very appropriate and very relevant discussion. 70 years of Chinese colonialism in Tibet offers certainly a huge amount of issues that would need to be discussed. I would like to share today some general observations from my position, my view as a political advocate for human rights and justice in Tibet in the international arena for the international campaign for Tibet. Colonialism, which is striking from my arena of work, colonialism is not that frequently used in the political and legal discourse on Tibet at this time. Colonialism is not being used to describe the political and social situation in Tibet. Instead, there is a different terminology that's being used. If the mode of governance and the political state of affairs in Tibet is being debated, there is terminology used such as authoritarianism, totalitarianism. Some speak of a police state, a surveillance state, or use simply the words repressive or oppressive. But from my point of view, these descriptions most commonly do not go beyond measuring questions of limitations of state power, or in the case of Tibet, of questions of witnessing the apparent limitless reach of Chinese state power in Tibet. Questions are: what rights are affected, to which degree, of what group of the population? Does the state persecute dissent? Does the state interfere with religious practice? Does it offer the space for any sort of economic activity? Does it respect cultural heritage and practice? Governments, every once in a while, lament the detention of an individual Tibetan. They criticize the CCP's intervention with selecting and appointing Tibetan Buddhist leaders, or they raise cases of torture. Less often, the mode of governance of the CCP in Tibet is considered in statements or declarations. In media reports about Tibet, even to a lesser degree, I would say, the connection is made to the mode of governance. I think this is something that's missing in popular or common understanding of Tibet today. The mode of governance applied by the CCP, plus quite specifically, what is its intention, and perhaps most importantly, what does it do to the objects of its governance, the Tibetans? I think as well, there are some quite specific observations that need to be made that are necessary for any observer to fully understand the situation. I think the concept of colonialism, which we are talking about today, if applied on Tibet, may indeed shed some light on what is going on in the country. Now, I do not want to go into details of theories and doctrines of colonialism. Let's just use this admittedly very simplistic definition. Classic definitions of colonialism view it as a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. There is political and economic control over a dependent territory. Oftentimes there's a population transfer to guarantee rule by loyal individuals, combined with a so-called civilizing mission as a rationale for the colonizers to reconcile the subjugation. I want to recall here a 1997 report published by the Unrepresented Peoples Organization, UNPO, entitled China's Tibet, the world's largest remaining colony. This detailed report, which was a result of an unofficial fact-finding mission to Tibet and Tibetan communities in exile, concludes with some sort of astonishment. It says, I quote, "The PRC, a state which has been at the forefront of the struggle against colonialism and which has been a champion of colonized people, is today undeniably a colonial power itself." And it continues, "China's rule over Tibet since 1951 has all the characteristics of colonialism in the real sense of the word. This is evident not only from the manner in which Chinese authority was established and is maintained in Tibet. It is clear from the way in which the Chinese authorities decide on and implement economic and other development policies and exploit natural resources, and from the population transfer of millions of Chinese into Tibet. It is clear also from the policies implemented by China regarding the revealing is the attitude of the Chinese authorities and of the Tibetan people, whose perceptions of each other are typical of those of the colonial power and the colonized people. End of quote. If we look at Tibet today, we find the observations made in this 1997 report still relevant. And they may even be more pressing than they were back then. I want to look at one distinct such development, which is a project of Sinicization in Tibet. Officially, this term has been introduced with regard to the religions being practiced in the PRC altogether. And it is not exclusively applied to Tibetan Buddhism, but also, as you know, to Christian and Muslim faith. According to official CCP understanding, in a nutshell, Tibetan Buddhism, a cornerstone of Tibetan culture and cultural heritage, is to adapt to the so-called socialist society with Chinese characteristics. This already has far-reaching consequences, as it inevitably will mean the end of Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet as a religious practice, if the Chinese authorities succeed. Instead, what will appear as Tibetan Buddhism is actually a belief system that serves the ideological goals of the one-party state. It may look as being religion, but it no longer is. The policies of Sinicization do stretch well beyond this example on religion. They apply to the recent restrictions regarding the use of the Tibetan language, which is apparently to be downgraded to a colloquial means of communication, and a language that is no longer part of cultural development, that cannot describe social innovations, technology, politics, art, or science. Tibetan is replaced by Chinese, the language of the occupying power. Equally worrisome is the drastic intervention of the Chinese state with the livelihoods of Tibetan nomads and herders who have been forcefully settled or relocated in the past decades, since the 1980s. According to media reports and estimates of human rights organizations, up to at least 2 million Tibetans have been subject to these policies. It must be noted that there is no legal redress available for Tibetans affected by these policies. In fact, information or statistics about Tibetans pursuing legal avenues are not available because not one Tibetan has sought them, quite obviously. Given that people have to leave their homes for good, with their lives being upended, with an uncertain future as recipients of government subsidies. And it must be striking that the Chinese authorities do not even attempt to hide these policies from the world. And it must be even more striking that the international community has not raised these policies with disgust and shock. The policies of Sinicization are aimed at reforming the thoughts and minds of Tibetans, so that Tibetans actually no longer are Tibetans, not speaking their language, not practicing their beliefs, and not living their lives. I think it needs to be understood that the CCP aims nothing less than reprogramming Tibetans' minds and hearts. The effects of the CCP policies in Tibet need to be discussed and addressed with greater urgency. The international community should not look at individual or single developments alone, but look at the big picture. There needs to be an understanding of the DNA of CCP rule in Tibet, its intentions, and foremost, what are the consequences for the Tibetan people. And I think from my very personal view, this should also entail a revisiting of the concept of cultural genocide. Colonialism, in a strict sense, requires one people subjugating the other. In the case of Tibet, in fact, from our point of view, from my point of view, one may come to the conclusion, given the policies of thought and behavioral reform as described before, one may come to the conclusion that Tibetans as a distinct people are to disappear altogether. Tibet without Tibetans. Against this background, the international community needs to realize and address the Sino-Tibetan conflict, as said, with greater urgency and on a different political level. Part of this should be a rebuttal and countering of the CCP's narrative with regard to its policies in Tibet. It will be crucial to point out the colonialist nature of the CCP's governance and to point out the openly discriminatory and thinly veiled racist view on Tibetans, which are integral parts of these policies. I'm looking forward to hearing the other presentations today of the participants of this webinar and would like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Kai, for a very precise insight into what is happening in Tibet. Tibet is today facing the danger of becoming a Tibet without Tibetans, or with the minds and hearts of people reprogrammed according to the communist ways of ruling a colony. Thank you very much. This is quite an eye-opener for all of us. And now I will request Mr. Jayadeva Ranade to please educate us on different aspects of what kind of colonialism activities are there, and how what are China's intentions and their style of functioning and their future plans. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. VIJAY KRANTI. Namaskar, good evening, and Tashidalek. At the outset, let me just say that with such a distinguished audience, there's no question of my educating anyone, but I would like to put across a few points that might add to the discussions. Firstly, today, of course, is the day which marks the 70th anniversary of China's occupation of Tibet, which is the theme of our webinar. And the Chinese also have taken note of it and come out with the white paper, which they released on the 21st. In other words, to coincide with this 70th anniversary. And the interesting part is that this white paper spends a considerable portion of time in terms of length of the white paper. It's a 41-page white paper with 10 chapters, and most of it is taken up by talking about how the West has been responsible for most of the unrest inside Tibet, and how the various Chinese dynasties have exercised control. They have not used the word sovereignty, but have exercised control over Tibet, and how Tibet was an integral part of China. So obviously, this state of affairs still rankles them. It still bothers them. And let me cite a few instances from the white paper. Firstly, they do say that this idea of Tibetan independence has come about only after the Opium Wars, and that it was the UK-led imperialists, quote unquote, who began to spread this idea. Then they say that the Yuan dynasty, which was there in the 13th and from 1271 to 1368, exercised jurisdiction and governance over Tibet. Its successor, Ming dynasty, began conferring titles like Prince, Prince of Dharma, etc., and also extended its military control all across Tibet, in Wutsang, Chamdo, and Nari. The successor to the Ming dynasty, namely the Qing government, it says, granted the honorific titles of Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama to the 5th Dalai Lama and to the 5th Panchen Lama, and introduced the 29 articles which regulate the reincarnation of lamas. Now, in this process, they have obviously toyed with history and historical facts as is known. But the significant point, as I was trying to make out, is that the Chinese are still insisting that they exercised sovereignty over Tibet, and they still feel it is important for them to keep justifying this or making the point. Later on, it does talk about the various developments that have taken place, the number of railway lines laid down, the roads built, etc. The villages electrified, and no doubt there has been considerable development and progress, but with the twin objectives of ensuring their military presence right along the borders to threaten other countries and also to exploit the mineral resources in Tibet. They have made it a point of referring to the religious personages in Tibet, and we do know from Chinese documents that the Chinese Communist cadres consider the monks and nuns of Tibetan Buddhism as the most troublesome element in Tibet. They have been persuading them to adapt Tibetan Buddhism to socialism with Chinese characteristics. They have been pressurizing them in various ways